Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics, and it certainly would not be spooky season without paying at least a little bit of tribute to the two kings of classic old school Hollywood horror, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. So it is my pleasure to be sitting here with prolific film historian, author, and screenwriter, Mr. Steve Haberman. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. I can't wait to see these movies again. There's two of my favorites. I even did the commentaries for the Blu-rays on them.
Oh yeah, they're amazing. So the first part of our double feature, we are going to take you back to 1935 for Universal Pictures' The Raven, starring the two titans of terror, Karloff and Lugosi. Now, Steve, this came out in 1935, which was just after the rise of or I should say, the enforcement of the Hollywood Production Code. That said, it is a wild film. It's out there. It's certainly as potent as any of the classic pre-code horrors. How was Universal able to get away with that?
Well, they were probably scratching their own heads. They had gotten away with it the year before. The code really was started to be enforced in 1934, and they released an incredibly, how shall I say, tasteless or progressive, shall we say, horror film called The Black Cat, which involved
Yes.
necrophilia, Satan worship, and all kinds of unsavory things, incest. And it came out, and it's a masterpiece. It's one of the great movies, and it was really their biggest moneymaker of the season, 1934. And so they decided to follow it up with another Karloff Lugosi Poe film, which was The Raven. And The Raven is this Poe drenched, completely passionate and sadistic movie about a doctor who is a sadist and is also obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe, and even has his own torture chamber in his basement. Bela Lugosi plays that part, so you're probably asking yourself what could go wrong. And what happened was it was
Yeah.
released in the United States, and one of the big markets for horror in the 1930s in this first round of horror films was Europe, specifically England, Great Britain. And when they took a look at it, England banned horror films. They said, we are not accepting any more American horror films because of The Raven. It's too gleefully sadistic, and we don't want to, corrupt the minds of our pure British citizens with this kind of, transgressive nonsense. So it
Yeah.
was directly responsible for the famous horror ban in England that lasted from basically 1935 to 1939. And they even created a new certificate for horror films in England, the H certificate. And they
Hmm.
started slapping that on movies in 1939. And ironically, the first one they slapped it on was a Bela Lugosi movie, which was called Dark Eyes of London in England, and here was
Oh,
called The Human Monster.
oh yes, yes. So 1935 is an interesting cutoff point because not only did you have The Raven, which I think is a very wonderful film, but you have the gleefully bizarre Mad Love with Peter Lorre, and of course the crown jewel Bride of Frankenstein. So what was the cutoff point? Did those movies make it to the UK at that
Yeah,
time?
yes, those movies made it to the UK. Um, in 1936, Universal released a couple of more. They released The Invisible Ray, but they decided to downplay the horror in the advertising, and they said it was science fiction.
Hmm.
And they released a kind of stripped down version of what was going to be a horror epic, Dracula's Daughter. That was originally going to be directed by James Whale,
Yeah.
and it was originally going to have cameos by Lugosi and Karloff in a prologue, but they stripped it down. They wrote a completely different script. I love Dracula's Daughter. As a
Of
matter of
course.
fact,
Yeah.
aside from the wonderfully Baroque prologue that James Whale never directed for his version of Dracula's Daughter, I think that the script to the existent Dracula's Daughter is better than the one that Whale was going to do. So so that was it. That was about it from Hollywood for England for a couple of years at least.
Yeah, and I know certainly for Universal Studios, it seemed like they took a little bit of a break until the new regime came in 1939, and of course you'd have that other great Karloff Lugosi pairing, Son of Frankenstein.
Well, yeah, Son of Frankenstein was a result of the fact that some enterprising theater owner uh, rented cheaply some battered prints of Dracula and Frankenstein, and I think Son of Khan too. And started running it, for 24 hours in his theater, and there were lines around the block. This was in
Mhm.
1938. And so Universal saw what these movies, these old movies, were grossing at this one theater, and they said, screw England. We have some masterpieces in our library. Let's go back to making horror films. And the new regime, as you rightly pointed out, made a lavish second sequel to Frankenstein called Son of Frankenstein with Karloff and Lugosi and Basil Rathbone and Lionel Atwill, and it was a big hit. So horror films were back.
Yeah, well, I want to circle back a little bit. So you previously mentioned The Black Cat. That is certainly a personal favorite of mine. I think it might be the crown jewel of the Universal's golden age of horror films. But that's a film where, as wonderful as it is, it really doesn't owe a lot to Edgar Allan Poe outside of the title. Whereas The Raven, it is all about the works of Poe, the imagery of Poe, and does it just as well, if not better, than the famous Vincent Price AIP movies of the 50s and 60s.
Well,
So,
I wouldn't say that exactly, but I would say
yeah.
that it is a kind of backhanded compliment to Poe.
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
Lugosi, Dr. Vaughn is the character that Lugosi plays in that movie. His version of Poe's madness, his state of mind when he was when he was writing, his horror classics in the 1830s and 1840s, is I think Dr. Volan is projecting. Let's put it that way. I think he's talking about himself when he's describing Poe's madness, but it certainly is my favorite horror film tribute to Poe. I mean, I think that Corman's House of Usher, Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death, those are
Oh,
masterpieces.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Those are truly some of the great horror films of all time, as is Edgar Ulmer's The Black Cat in 1934 with Karloff and Lugosi. I wouldn't say that The Raven is exactly a masterpiece, but I'd say it's a tremendous horror film. I think it's a lot of fun, and it has some wonderful ideas. And as I said, I think it's just a glorious, passionate, backhanded compliment to why we, as perpetual adolescent boys, love the works of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, well, Steve, thank you so much. If you're in the audience, please stick around after the film so you can hear the rest of our conversation. Without further ado, from 1935, Bela Lugosi and Karloff starring in The Raven. Wow, to me, that movie is still a lot of fun.
Oh yeah, it's great. It's a great movie. I mean, look, I think the two greatest Universal horror films are Bride of Frankenstein and The Black Cat. I mean,
Mhm.
they are uh, uh, way above the Call of Duty.
Yeah,
They're not just great horror films, but they're also great auteurist pieces.
yes.
In the case of The Black Cat, it's one of the most potent movies about the PTSD from World War One, which was epidemic in the United States and Europe for, 15, 20 years until World War Two.
Mhm.
It really, I mean, in melodramatic terms, it really does brilliantly illustrate how fucked up the veterans who unfortunately survived that traumatic experience were for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And so it's relevant in that way because we'll never stop having wars and we'll never stop screwing up our youth, having them go out as cannon fodder. So it's the nature of our violent tribalism.
Mhm.
So that's always going to happen. So the Black Cat is always going to be a relevant film. I mean, to me, that's as relevant a film as The Deer Hunter or Platoon.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's interesting you bring that aspect of it up because that's one of the few times in these types of films where Bela Lugosi, he essentially is the hero of the piece, but like you
Yeah,
said, he's just as fucked up as Karloff is in a lot of ways.
more so. Who skins who in the end?
That's true. That's well, Karloff had it coming, I think.
Well, yeah. It's just some people would say nobody has that coming, but
That's true.
yeah, Dr.
That's
Verdigus would argue with you.
that's true. Well, Edgar G. Ulmer did such a brilliant job on that initial film. Since The Raven was essentially a follow-up, why was he not asked to direct this one?
Would you like to know?
Please, yeah.
Because Carl Laemmle wanted Edgar G. Ulmer as the young, talented new director at Universal to
Hmm.
marry his, I believe it was his granddaughter,
Hmm.
and they were a thing, or maybe it was his daughter. I think maybe it was Carl Laemmle's daughter.
Hmm.
But what happened was Edgar Ulmer started having an affair with his script girl, on the Black Cat, and so he was banished
Hmm. Oh wow. Yeah, that's
and
and I
really
mean
blacklisted in the industry. You notice Edgar G. Ulmer never directed another Studio A picture again. He
that's
he
true.
directed
Yeah.
he directed a lot of independent films that were brilliant, like Detour and Bluebeard and stuff like that. But he was never given another studio assignment of like the Black Cat. He would have
Well,
been the next James Whale probably.
the director of this film, Louis Friedlander, I think he does a pretty good job. Even though the movie couldn't get Ulmer, of course, a director of his caliber, what do you think of Friedlander's direction?
I think he was a great choice because Louis Friedlander, Lou Landers, cut his teeth on serials, and the Raven becomes a serial at the end. I mean, it's so exciting, the intercutting
Yeah,
between you know Judge Thatcher on the pendulum table and everybody trying to break into Dr. Vollin's lab, and then putting the lovers in the room where the walls come together, and Karloff taking a bullet for them. I mean, it's just exciting as hell at the end. And I think he directed the old dark house segment extremely well as well. I mean,
hmm,
that the basis I think of the I think the basis of the success of the Raven, aside from the brilliant concept of having this mad doctor who's obsessed with Edgar Allan Poe, um, is Lugosi. You
yeah,
know, Karloff, although he's top billed, is really given a very secondary character. He's brilliant in it. I mean, it's a great part for Karloff because what Karloff brought to the horror genre was empathy. Whether it was the Mummy or whether it was the monster in Frankenstein, he always there was always a moment where the audience sympathized with him.
hmm,
And Lugosi never asks for sympathy. Sometimes he accidentally gets it because of the passion of his emotions. He's the most expressionistic talky actor. He doesn't try to be realistic. He acts every moment of every scene. Every line Bela Lugosi is acting in, and when he does that, you you can't help but get involved in whatever insane motive he has, whether it's vengeance in the Black Cat or whether it's even in this film where he's a psychopathic sadist uh and egotist. Even then he's so passionate about Poe and about this woman that he's obsessed with, and about being given everything that he thinks he deserves. And you can see that there's a bitterness in him too. He doesn't feel like he's been given his uh his just glory as a surgeon, even though everybody says he's the best. You could see they think he's the best, but he's a little creepy. And you feel that from Lugosi in this. And I think along with Friedlander directing this like it's a chapter play, Lugosi acting this like it's I don't know, it's a combination of King Lear and the Grand Guignol.
yeah.
I think that's what really makes this a successful movie.
Absolutely. Now, I'm glad you bring up that this is very much, despite it being second build, I don't get that, but this is very much Lugosi's film. It's his showcase. Where was Lugosi at this point in his career in 1935?
Well, what everybody does is they contrast Karloff and Lugosi.
Yeah.
And what happened was when Lugosi was passed over for the Monster and Frankenstein, and he didn't turn it down. The studio was not going to give it to him. Lemley Jr. did not like the screen test that Robert Florey did with Lugosi for the Monster and Frankenstein, and Karloff was a sensation in the role, and he brought so much to it. He brought so much to it that even James Whale was jealous of Karloff. And they put Karloff on a star contract because they said, "Hey, we have Lon Chaney. This is Lon Chaney. He's back. We'll make him the man of a thousand faces." And they did. They put him in the old dark house, and they put him in the Mummy, and other studios hired him, and they put him in things like the Mask of Fu Manchu and the Ghoul in the early 30s. And he really became the face of the horror film. He was a much more, as I said before, he was a much more sympathetic character, and he was also easier to cast in different types of roles than Lugosi.
Mhm.
Lugosi had his strengths. He was the best at what he did, but he wasn't really versatile. Karloff was quite versatile. He was quite nimble as an actor, and especially as a character actor. And so Universal chose to make Karloff the star, and they gave him, contracts, multi-picture contracts. They gave him star salaries. Lugosi, they hired on a picture-by-picture basis. He was valuable on a marquee in a horror film, and so it was valuable to have Lugosi. And what they found by pairing him in The Black Cat is that he was even more valuable when he was paired with Karloff. And
Mhm.
so, Lugosi worked, but he was never, very few movies after uh, the three pictures that were made with Karloff were built around Lugosi.
Yeah.
Lugosi would be cast as Igor in Son of Frankenstein. He stole the movie from Karloff, but he was cast in that part. He was cast in Black Friday. He was cast in The Night Monster. He was cast in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. But Karloff, they would sign um, a contract with for multiple pictures and find projects for him that they
Yeah.
thought that would be profitable, but also boost his value to them as a star.
Hmm. Well, and I know there's a lot of urban legends, there's a lot of myths floating around. Based on your research, what do you think? Was there resentment between Lugosi and Karloff because of their situation?
Well, I don't know. You would have to look into their souls, into their hearts for that.
But on the record, have you read anything?
No,
No, yeah,
no, that's, Ed Wood is, I know there's two screenwriters of Ed Wood. I said, Bela Lugosi Jr. is very pissed off at you guys.
yeah.
He said their father's nothing. And they said, we know, we just thought it would be funny if Bela Lugosi cursed. And it was.
Mhm.
But I don't think publicly Lugosi would have ever said anything
Of course not.
of a
Yeah.
resentful nature about Karloff. In his heart of hearts, he may have thought that uh, he was given short shrift. But and Karloff, Karloff was, I don't want to say dismissive of Lugosi, but he kind of like was he wasn't shy about showing pity for Lugosi.
Mhm.
Later on, when after Lugosi had died, he'd call him poor Bela. He'd say he never really learned the language properly, and so he didn't get the parts that he deserved. He was kind of like pity bragging. Carlo was,
Right.
if there's such a thing. And that's my opinion. I mean, but we'll never know.
Of course. Do you have any closing thoughts on The Raven?
Yes, I think The Raven is a wonderfully fun example of universal horror at the peak, when the Lumleys were in charge, when Karloff and Lugosi were stars, when they were adapting, if you can call it that, horror literary classics in their own sort of style. And it's just what it is. It's a great movie about a character, the Lugosi character, Dr. Valen, who wants to control death. He wants to control death as a surgeon, and he wants to control death as a lover, and he wants to control death as a sadist. And we see him try to do all of those things tragically, and they result in his tragic demise. He was obviously a great man with this flaw of wanting to control and be a god, as he tells Irene Ware, and uh, and it destroys him in the end. And I think that's the value of the horror film, because it really discusses the verboten topic of our death, and The Raven does that. It also, that's the one thing that horror films do. The other thing that horror movies do, The Raven does in spades, and that is allows us to be a sociopath for an hour and a half and gleefully take what we want and destroy what we hate without conscience. And identify with a character like that. And who better to identify with as a, completely raving sociopath than Bela Lugosi?
That's true. I mean, I suppose that is the inherent appeal of the horror film, right? We get to
It's
live
one of them.
vicariously through these characters.
Yeah, you want to be Vincent Price in House of Wax. You want to be Karloff in The Mummy. You want to be Lugosi in The Raven. You want to be these, completely unhinged psychopaths, because you know what? We all have a little sociopath standing on our shoulder, whispering in our ear, appealing to our worst nature, telling us to go out and, get that girl or destroy that guy. And so it's fun to identify with a character like that.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your time. If you're in the audience, please stick around. We will present The Body Snatcher from 1945, and Steve will be back too. So, thank you, Steve.